So, our topic is an introduction to Christian liturgy in all of its diverse forms, and we decided that perhaps the best way to go about it, because it's a very big topic, is to begin by doing a brief historical survey, but try and keep it relevant and interesting so it's not too dry and abstract. Liturgy is a really sort of dynamic, interactive thing. It was one of my least favourite courses at Oxford because I found it it was taught in a very dry and historical way, and I didn't really follow it very well. I believe it's being taught very differently now, in a way that's a bit more interesting. So we're going to start with early Christian worship, and last week we looked at the questions of what these words connotate. What do we think of when we think about liturgy and worship and church service and divine office and mass? And I think we came to the conclusion that all of these words basically are associated with what people do when they get together to worship God, what they do in church, what they do in the temple, what they do in their Christian meeting places. Some of them are associated with certain very specific things. So they might be associated with low church or high church. Here's a low church service. Looks like it might even be held in somewhere like Newport's, with the wooden benches there and the Calvinist ministers. Do you think he's taking the bread around? Could be, this chap here in the frock coat.
Yeah, and the other one is the cup.
And here's the cup. Yeah. Here's a more high church liturgy with women servers, so I'm guessing that this is probably an Episcopal church, perhaps, although they have women now in the Roman Catholic Church who are servers. That never used to be the case until fairly recently, I think. Even within denominations, there's a lot of controversy about what worship should look like. So, should it look, people are saying, should we have guitars? We don't want guitars in church. You might recognise this particular slide. As you can see, it's from La Vie est un long fleuve tranquille, a very funny film. What's that?
Recording? Are you recording?
Oh, I am recording, yes. Yeah, sorry. Other people say no guitars in church, we want proper organs like this one in Notre Dame. So there's, that used to be in Notre Dame, I suppose it disappeared in the fire.
No, I think the organ is preserved actually.
Did the organ get preserved? Yeah.
The organ is not in the fire. Disappeared.
Yeah. It's one of the most famous organs in the world, this in Notre Dame. So, we're still in the middle of controversy about what form worship should take. Should you have improvised prayers, or should you have proper prayers that you read from a book? Here's a little quotation from J.B. Priestley. Our dourest parsons who followed the non-conformist fashion of long extempore prayers always seemed to me to be bent on bullying God. So the people who like a proper well-written form, the proper well-written collect or something, they think that these long prayers that sound like laundry lists asking God to do this and God to do that and God to do the other, they're not very fond of that particular form. I think it's important to be able to do both, but if you just stick to one, it can become very wordy and very long. And if you just stick to the other, it can seem to be quite dry and become a little fossilized to the form that you're using. Now, the comforting thing about this, because we sometimes think, the modern church is characterized by so much division and confusion about what the liturgy should be like. We're not the first Christians in history to have had this problem. We're not the first generation of Christians to find liturgy or worship or the form our worship takes controversial. Here are two little problems to address before we discuss the way that earliest Christians engaged in worship. First of all, the earliest Christian descriptions of what Christian assemblies looked like, or assemblies of the Jesus movement looked like, they're not neat and tidy descriptions of what the liturgy was. In Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, he's shouting at the members of that community for doing things wrong. He's not congratulating them for doing things right. So we're not really exactly sure of what it looked like from the Bible. There it is. When you meet together, you're not really interested in the Lord's Supper. Some of you hurry to eat your own meal without sharing with others, and as a result, some go hungry and others get drunk. Don't you have your own homes for eating and drinking? Or do you really want to disgrace God's church and shame the poor? What am I supposed to say? Do you want me to praise you? Well, I certainly won't praise you for this. So we can guess that maybe they were a little bit more ordered, but quite what that order looked like is still up for discussion. We don't really know exactly. So rather than getting a description in the Bible of what Christians were doing right when they meet together, we get more of a description of what they were probably doing wrong. But that doesn't mean we've got no clue about what they were doing, because we've got lots of clues. The second thing that we need to think about when we talk about early Christian worship is that the way in which the ancient world thought about worship was very different from what we mean in the modern world about worship. Now, for most of us, the word worship is used to refer to something that we do outwardly as a community in church, like this top picture there in probably a Presbyterian church, I'm guessing, something like that. It's a communal activity, this worship. But for some other people, it refers to something that goes on inside themselves. So they're going to say something like, I can worship God on the top of a mountain or by a beach. I don't need to go and worship in a church. So it's a sort of mindset rather than something that people do in groups. Not that the people in the top there don't have a mindset, I'm sure they do. But the way we use this word worship is very different from the way they used it in the ancient world, or thought about it in the ancient world. It can even mean to us a certain sort of music. People, what do you think of when you hear somebody saying worship songs? They're not hymns, they're worship songs. It's very often, some chorus or something, or, majesty, or, we love you, Jesus, you're so wonderful. They very often don't have that much of a theological content or a poetical content that's full of images. A worship song is a sort of losing yourself in your own adoration somewhere. I don't know, difficult to describe. Now, in the earliest church, this word used for worship meant an awful lot of things. Not just a ritual, not just an outward thing that you do, but anything that you do that enacts or sort of reflects your reverence for God or for the gods. So let's think of it, when we look through this, as worship is a way of being, not just a way of acting. It's a whole mindset, a whole sort of way of being in the world. That means the ancient world thought of worship in a much, much, much bigger way than we do. If we think of worship as just this thing that you see at the top of the screen, we're not going to get very far in understanding what the ancient world, or what the first Christians thought of as worship. So the categories of what we think of as worship or liturgy don't really coincide with theirs. Did you want to add something there, Joyce?
Yeah, maybe a couple of words that can help you. So it would be also a bit like close to etiquette, to way of being, to way of life. All these words can be understood under the ancient conception of worship. In the different forms, it's a form of belonging to each other, to society, to the group in a way that's not just punctual and not detached from other forms of, or more or less detached from other forms of community.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I think we're going to explore a little bit of that as we go through. Think for a moment, do you remember when Jesus is walking on the water and he calms the storm and he climbs into the boat? And then it says the disciples worshipped him. What comes into your mind when you think of that story? Did they get out their Book of Common Prayer? Well, no, clearly they didn't. What did they do at that particular moment when Jesus got back into the boat? What was the form of their worship? Was it just saying, "Wow, Jesus, you're amazing. That was quite something. Can you do that again for our friends?" Or yes, we need to post it on Instagram. We didn't get it the first time round. What that word probably means there was that they prostrated themselves. They lay flat inside the boat in awe of him. So worship here is referring to a position of the body, not a series of words or a sort of abstract, formal thing. It's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes when we hear that passage, we think, oh, well, maybe they started to sing a song. But actually, no, that's not what the Bible is inferring here. It's saying that worship can be a bodily action without words at all. They were expressing their awe and their wonder, their reverence through their bodies. So, in the New Testament itself, we get very few clues about the specifics of very distinctive liturgical practices, as I've said. But we get a very good idea about the spirit in which those earliest Christians disposed themselves in relation to God and in relation to Jesus. So their orientation towards God wasn't expressed just through what we think of as formal worship, which is what we might think of. What's your orientation to God? If you ask that question of yourself, you might say, well, I go to church, or I watch the live stream, or I take communion, or I say my prayers. But in the ancient world and for the earliest Christians, their worship was expressed also through their service of each other, in charity, in justice. And we can also get some idea of what those earliest Christians were doing when they thought they were worshipping. We remember the context that they came from. They were Jewish Christians. So a lot of their understanding about worship or reverence came from their own spiritual and their own cultural background. I can't remember what slide I got next here. Here's an example of what perhaps they thought of as worship. Anybody recognise what might be happening here? I can tell you that this is Peter. It's at the beautiful gate of the temple. Remember, early on in the book of Acts, they come across this man who was begging at the beautiful gate, asking for alms. And Peter famously says, "Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I thee. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk." For the early church, this was a way of reverencing Jesus, a way of following Jesus. Just like in Islam, there are 5 pillars of Islam. And in Islam, all of those 5 pillars are considered to be a way of reverencing God. And one of those pillars is support of the poor. And this, within the Islamic tradition, this is a way of worship too. It's not just the prostrations and the prayers that happen in the mosque. It's an orientation of your life. Something perhaps we've lost a little bit in the secular West, when our worship world can become very separated from our social world. And that certainly wasn't the case for those earliest Christians. This was a way of worship too. Here's a very interesting case. In the book of Acts, for instance, Paul is stuck on a ship on his way to Rome, and there's a massive storm at sea. And everybody starts to panic. They're obviously not all Christians on this boat. They're taking Paul to be tried, I believe, in Rome. It's not his missionary journey there. And Paul says, "Don't worry, you all need something to eat." Now, if it stopped there, it would sound like grandma, wouldn't he? Your problem is you've got nothing in your stomach. If you eat something, you'll feel a little bit better. But then it says, Paul took the bread and he broke it and shared it among the people on the boat. So in this act of calming the storm for his fellow passengers on this boat, something that we would associate with liturgical language, that is, taking the bread and distributing it, isn't just calming their stomachs, it's taking care of them and calming the storm. So this line between what you do in a worship service and what you do in your daily life, in your orientation to God, is blurred very much in this particular story in the book of Acts. And unless we understand that, we won't be able to understand why Paul's action on that boat was an act of worship and not just a practical way of helping them to get over seasickness. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's really showing that their conception of worship is not something as linear as what we conceive now as worship. Like you go to church, you arrive at a point, and you do the stuff, and that's going in one direction because you're asking something, you want like kind of an interaction. This is more like a multi-dimensional approach to worship. So maybe you could compare it like as an analogy to the different ways you relate to your body and other people's bodies. Like the fact that you eat, the fact that you go to the gym, the fact that you go, like you kiss someone, all these different attitudes that are relating to your body and involved in different contexts are where the places, the possible places of worship for these early Christians or early followers of Christ.
There are some other little clues that we can get about what happened in early Christian communities when they came together to worship. The Didache, the teachings of the 12 apostles, is one of those places where we can get a little bit of a clue. This dates from about 100 AD, and it contains instructions for things like baptism, even a little bit of instruction about the Eucharist, and some instructions about the leadership of the earliest church there. This is within a generation and a half of Jesus, maybe a bit more, maybe 2 generations, 100 AD, when we think that a generation probably lasted between 30 and 40 years. So it's not early, but it's earlier than a lot of other stuff that we have. Let's think for a minute then about some of the ways in which those early Christians came together. The first thing that we're going to... there's the earliest copy of the, or shred of the Didache that exists, dug up, I believe, somewhere in Egypt. Oxyrhynchus or somewhere like that. When we think of Holy Communion, this is pretty much what we think of about eating in the Bible. We think of the Last Supper. If we see images like these, one of the first things that we're likely to do is to start counting how many people are around the table, or at least that's what I do. And then the next thing I do is look at what they might be eating and see if I can spot Jesus. And then I think, can I see John and Peter? And where's Judas? And whenever we think about early Christian eating or Jesus eating, these are the sort of images we think of. We associate Jesus eating with what is called the Last Supper. Here are a few more of those images, and they're depicted in ways that send our minds down in this direction. Here's another one. Once again, you're counting the heads, and you can see John leaning on Jesus' heart there, on his left shoulder. We can't see Judas in this particular picture, can we? Is he the one leaving?
Taking the bowl to get
Yes, taking the bowl there. And there we just see bread and wine on the table. Here's another Dutch image of the Last Supper. See how much it's entered into our common understanding when we think of Jesus eating? I think I've got a couple more. Yes, there's a sort of very Russian scene. Yes, yeah. We can still spot Jesus, not just because he's holding the cup, I don't think, but because of his position on the table. And John seems to be resting, well, no, that's on the right side, isn't it? Here's another one. You see how common these images are? What you find very often is that they're imbued with this spiritual light. Something very special, very unique is happening in these eating occasions. This is not a common occasion. It's something like we do when we go to church. And that's unfortunate, because perhaps the early church didn't immediately associate eating a meal with fellow Christians with this sort of idea or this sort of image.
I don't know if you're going to talk about that, Nigel, but is that we are focusing on the Last Supper.
Yes.
And not talking about the other meals. But for the early Christians, when they're coming together, it's one of the meals. And the Last Supper is kind of paradigmatic, but it's not the whole and the only one, like we do today in the liturgy and in so much of what we understand. We have this one narrative basically about the Last Supper, but we don't talk so much about all the other meals. That when you put them in contrast with the Last Supper, can qualify, can nuance what's the Last Supper. When you have all this, for instance, the meal you just talked about with the boat and the fact that there were a lot of people who were not like direct followers of Christ on this boat, where Paul shared the food. What does it mean then for the question of what we're doing and that we're calling the Holy Eucharist?
Mm. It's interesting, isn't it, that we call it the Last Supper as if it was some sort of graduation ceremony. That's it now. This is the ne plus ultra of what Christians are supposed to do when they eat. It's the end of the line. And there must have been, for it to be called the Last Supper, there must have been lots of other suppers too.
It's very, when you read the Bible and the Hebrew Bible and you follow the mindset of the authors, you realize that they like to give you a lot of stories that you're supposed to read together. You're not supposed to pick up one and say this one is the total and the only one and the true one. And that's why these texts are also always related, talking about the Hebrew Bible, Ancient Testament, but also the New Testament. Like there are always like little images that you will find that tell you like, hey, relate this text to another one. So like, for instance, the conversion of Paul, we talked about that, has to be read vis-a-vis Jonas and the fish. Or all these meals, they can also be read against other texts. And then by comparing in this little crack that you have between the texts, you can expand and learn more and meet what's this spirit actually doing, the Spirit of God is doing. So it's really a shame to be reading kind of the Last Supper has the one and the ones that are kind of like underneath, that kind of like, well, it was before, it was not really ready, they didn't really know what they were doing, and then there was the last one that actually gave you the whole meaning of what we're doing when we're eating with Christ.
And that we have to imitate only one of those meals, which is the best one, the Last Supper, with a capital T and an L and an S.
Yeah.
But very, very early in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verse 24, the author of the Acts of the Apostles says that the little Christian community in Jerusalem devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of the bread and the prayers. So those earliest followers of Jesus there, the disciples and those who were early on converted to that movement, were meeting for meals. And those meals were the forerunners of what we now call the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, or Mass, or the Lord's Supper. But it was actually a meal that they were meeting together to share. The meal was this central act, perhaps, around which all of their other activities like preaching or prayer or prophecy or reading or telling stories, all of these things unfolded within the context of the meal. On Maunday Thursday, we hold a service in the church to celebrate Jesus' institution of the Eucharist. But actually, as Joris was saying, Jesus had many, many meals with his disciples, with his friends, with his followers, his associates, and even with his enemies. And a lot of those meals are recorded in the New Testament. They're so peppered throughout the New Testament that we sometimes read them over without even thinking. Think of how many of the parables end with a feast. What does the widow do when she finds the lost coin? She doesn't say, "Oh, what a silly idiot I am, I must go out and buy some more cleaning fluid." She invites all her friends round for a meal. Even in the parables, these meals appear. There's in Jesus' miracles, there are many miracles that are associated with feasts. From his first miracle in Cana of Galilee at the wedding feast, all the way through to the feeding of the 5,000 and the Last Supper. So perhaps it's wrong for us to think that the Last Supper was completely different, more religious than the other meals that Jesus shared. Here are some of those that I could find. See if you can guess which ones these are. They're a little bit tricky. The one at the top here is on the left-hand side is probably the easiest one to spot, because there we've got Jesus with his mother, and clearly the bride and the groom seated at the top end of the table. So what we've got here is the wedding at Cana in Galilee. On the right-hand side, we used to sing a little song at Sunday school. Zacchaeus was a very little man was he. Anybody sang that song? He climbed up into a sycamore tree, his saviour for to see. And when Jesus passed by, he said, "Zacchaeus, what are you doing up the tree?" He said, "I'm up here to see you." And he said, "We must eat together tonight." So even this little chance encounter ended up with another meal.
And all this is not just like a historic thing that's recounted, but it's always linked to typologies, and it's always related to other texts. So like, why is it in the tree, and why does it end up in the meal? Well, do you remember what happened in trees and what was eaten after the tree? So all of this has to be read together with Mary and Jesus at this banquet, where you actually never hear anything about the bride and the groom.
No, we don't know.
But there is this very strange dynamic between the mother, who is like a feminine figure, and the son, and all about the lack of something to eat or to drink, the fruit, like something which is the juice of a fruit that he actually creates, and he asks her, woman,
what have you to do with me?
Yes, what have you to do with me? Which could have been the answer of Adam and in the Genesis narrative. So you always have to read this text, and the question of of food is linked to the question of theology. It's not separate, and it's not an add-on of the New Testament. Like it's inscribed in the traditions and the interpretations and the faith and the spiritual life of these peoples.
On the bottom left there, you've got Jesus eating with the Pharisees. You can see they've got in the dress that they believe that they dressed in with this turban and what have you. Very respectable household here. Nice food and servant and all of the rest of it. I can't remember who painted that, but that's what's supposed to be going on. Here is Jesus at another meal. We can see on the bottom left here the woman that is anointing Jesus being in this particular story. Who else have we got? Did I have any others? This one is probably easy to spot too. This is another miracle about food, and it's the feeding of the 5,000. There's Jesus in the middle with the 2 fish. So we can see it goes all the way through his ministry. What did Jesus do at his resurrection? He was recognized in the breaking of the bread after the road to Emmaus, and here the disciples in the boat are saying, it's him. What do they do next? They have a meal, a fish on the shore. So right from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, it's like there's bookends here of meals. The first miracle and the last appearance of Jesus being associated, well, apart from the ascension, I suppose, perhaps the fish went up with him. I don't know. He ate the fish, didn't he? So it must have gone up with him in his stomach, I suppose. To the last appearances there, we see of Jesus being associated with eating, with sharing food. So that can't be underlined enough, because we're going to discover what the ramifications of this are. So the act of sharing food in the ancient world was a real mixture of what we would call secular and what we would call sacred. It was a mixture of what we might call intimate and what we might call public. It was a mixture of the formal and the informal. It was a mixture of what might be a celebration and what might be something more solemn. Now, one of the reasons for this is that if you were going to serve meat at your feast, that animal had previously been sacrificed to God or to one of the gods. So already you can't make a distinction between having some friends round for supper and what you might be doing in a religious context, because the very food that you're eating has worship significance, if I can put it that way. For us, sometimes we think we've done the job when we've said grace before the meal, and then we get on with the business of eating. But the ancient world didn't see it like that. Everything was more jumbled up, folded in on itself. It was more integrated, all of these things. So if we said to them, is that sacred or secular? They would say, I'm sorry, but I really do not understand your question. I don't get what you're driving at. These two things you can't drive a wedge between these two things.
And it's also more integrated when we're talking about meat, for instance, with the question of the life of the animal. Because if you were sacrificing the meat, the animal, to a deity, it's because it had a life in the first place. So life was worth something. And so, of course, after it was a problem to which god you were actually sacrificing it. But you had through the question, the religious problem of which meat you're going to eat with whom, the actual question of what's the life of the animal. You don't just buy a chunk of meat that you eat without thinking of anything. There is a question of power which is linked to the sacrality of the life behind these questions.
I've always liked that idea, that the life is not taken lightly and in some huge factory somewhere and picked up in a plastic wrapping in Costco. There's some thanks given for this, and a more reverential sharing of the life stream that flows through us all, the blood that flows through us all. Grains that made up bread, it wasn't just wheat. Various different grains would be used to provide what we call bread at a meal, kamut, and various other grains that have staged a comeback in the modern world. These grains were common to Jews and Gentiles. Bread was often the centre of the meal. They might have had knives, but they most certainly didn't have forks. And if you wanted to scoop something up, just as you would in Morocco or the Middle East now, the bread, or in France, it's polite to make sure you get the last drop of that delicious sauce that somebody has spent a lot of time preparing, and use your bread to sop it up. So bread is pretty central as a utensil as well as everything else. It's the means by which the food is transferred to your mouth.
It's very interesting when you think of it in relation to the Eucharist.
Yes.
The incarnational, and how Christ is the way.
Also, wine was drunk, and not just on special occasions. Wine was a part of pretty much everybody's diet. It might have not been Chateau Lafite style, but you certainly would have a little glass of something at pretty much every meal. Water was the other option. I suppose if you were in Egypt too, you could have beer, which was a popular thing to have. What you can see here is a Roman sarcophagus, I believe, showing these acts of sacrifice. What you can see on the far right-hand side there is the official person for whom the sacrifice is being offered. She's paid for it, the lady here on the right. Her role in this is simply to take some of the blood of the animals that are being sacrificed and to pour it on the burning altar in a libation. She's not going to be the one that kills the animal. That's going to be done by specialists who are lined up behind with various instruments. What you can't see on the right-hand side here is the priest who is going to perform the prayers, and some of the songs and the people who are playing the musical instruments that were very much associated with sacrifice in the ancient world. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. So you can see here that here are some images too of what happened at those banquets, and how this distinction between the sacred and the secular is blurred. On the right-hand side there, you can see the sacrifice happening, but you can also see that a little butchery has already occurred, and the meat is being cooked over the altar in this Greek vase. These Greek vases are wonderful sources of information about what happened in the ancient world when people got together for feasts. On the left-hand side there, clearly, you can see that there's music involved here. The food is here on these little tables. Here is the crater that would have the wine and the water mixed together. And everybody is reclining. Don't forget that, because it's going to come up again in a little minute. As you can see, they were also the occasion of a lot of hanky-panky, and some hanky-panky is a little bit more graphic on these Greek vases than on this particular one, which is rather more chaste. I decided not to use some of the other images that are rapidly found on the internet, if you'd like to see what a Greek or Roman banquet might have entailed sometimes. Here again is the interior of a house, I believe it's in Pompeii, with people reclining on these things. This is clearly the second part of the feast, would you say, Joris? Where they've eaten their jolly good meal already, and now they're sharing the wine at the end of that meal. We'll talk about that in a second. We sometimes associate this Last Supper in the Bible with the Jewish Passover. Have you heard that before? There used to be this trend of people having a shared Seder Passover meal on Good Friday, but I think luckily that has now gone out of fashion, because clearly it's confusing people about the nature of what the Last Supper actually was, and interpreting it through a tradition that is clearly not carried through in the Gospels themselves. But when you look at the Passover meal, that itself is influenced by ancient Mediterranean banqueting tradition. Remember, most of the Jews in Jesus' day did not live in Judea. They were spread all over the Mediterranean world. They didn't even speak Aramaic or Hebrew. They spoke Greek or Latin. So their eating habits were profoundly affected by the countries that they'd moved into or the new lands that they were in. Whatever the Last Supper was, though, Christians of later generations, not these very, very earliest Christians that we're talking about, certainly celebrated a sort of remembrance of Passover in their own feast of Easter. The very word for the Paschal meal, the Paschal imagery of the lamb that was slain, to interpret the death and resurrection of Jesus. But let's not let that confuse us. If we only look at it through that lens, we'll be missing something very special about what these early Christian meals were all about. Now, as we've already seen, there are lots of accounts of Jesus eating in the New Testament. We saw some examples of that all the way through his ministry. The earliest Christians must have felt that their meals, when they got together in the ways that we're about to describe, were a continuation of this whole series of Jesus' eating, his banquets, his suppers. Not just the memorialization of what we've come to call the Last Supper. They were carrying on something that they'd done with Jesus for a very long time. They'd eaten with Jesus, they'd shared with Jesus, they told stories about what they'd done that day, repeated his miracles and everything else.
Maybe when we say continuation, we also have this very linear way of thinking, and thinking that they were actually thinking of themselves as in very historical pattern, that Jesus was in the past, and we are actually now doing what he did. But it would be, I think, a misconstrual or something. Can be a misconstrual, because, and that's whole of what these texts are about. Jesus, that's what we confess actually during the Eucharist, when we say he came.
Christ has died. Christ has risen. Christ will come again.
And Christ will come again, and saying that at the moment of the meal also means that it's happening now.
Yes.
And the next meal is going to be this come again too. And so all this continuation is also just a presentification of the presence of Christ, even if the doors are closed. You see, like what happens at the Pentecost, right?
And it's more circular. So it's more circular than linear.
Yeah. It doesn't have to come in. It's not only remember. It's not for us. It's very difficult to understand sometimes, because we have, even if we don't want it, we still have this very reformed way of thinking about, and modern way of thinking about the meal, is that it's kind of a memorial still, because we have also this historicist worldview that say that the Bible is in the past and the New Testament is in the past. But it's not true for a Christian point of view.
No.
Because it's the present, and that's how the doors can be closed, and at the same time Jesus come in, because he's with us.
I think that's where the earliest patterns must have come from too. The repetition of that same pattern is taking you into an eternal time, not into a sort of location in the present, or we've got to do all the work now for ourselves, but a repetition of that eternal moment of sharing. So you get this pattern that appears: the breaking of the bread, the blessing of the bread, or the giving thanks. Then you've got the breaking of the bread, and then the distributing of the bread to the people present. This comes up in that incident that we saw with Paul on the boat, and in other incidents as well. In 1 Corinthians 11, it's the oldest version of... just a quick word about libations. These libations done with wine, very often, were done by Jews, they were done by Romans, by Greeks. A little bit of the wine would be poured onto the ground as an offering to the gods before you actually drank it yourself as an act of thanksgiving or remembrance or blessing. I remember in a church I was at in Tottenham with Father Hopes, who was a difficult man to work for, let's just put it that way. He sort of ate curates for breakfast, and poor old Chris, he'd had enough, and he resigned. And I said, listen, Chris, I'm going to take you, because you've got to inform the area dean. So off we drove in the car to go and see the area dean to announce Chris's resignation from his position as curate and what he was going to do next. The area dean had lived for a long time in Jamaica, where he was in charge of a church there. And he said, what we need is rum. So he went to his cupboard, and it was a new bottle. And he pulled out the bottle of rum from his cupboard, cracked open the top, and poured a little bit on the Persian carpet in his rectory. And he said, that one's for God. Now he's going to help us sort this out. So it's funny that tradition has not have kept itself alive.
It's fun, but it's also saying a lot about what the West is compared to some more like other Caribbean traditions, or like voodoo, or like in Haiti too, or other cultures which are not so secularized.
Yes, yeah. That you could do it before you had a little cocktail.
Yeah.
I could imagine the faces of some of the Upper East Siders if you started pouring the wine on the carpet before you drank it. Yes, on the Persian carpet. So sometimes these libation cups were very ceremonial, like you can see in this particular picture. Sometimes they might have been far more simple. So where are we? We're talking about the 1 Corinthians 2, the oldest written version of the words of institution that we still use in the Holy Communion services today. And in the ancient world, formulae like that, he took bread and broke it, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, take this is my body, which is given for you, do this in remembrance of me. It's that famous passage. These sacrifices that people offered, these libations that people offered, expressed really how closely any believer felt that their well-being, their safety, their thriving was dependent on these forces that might be out of sight. They might not be able to see them, they might be able to feel them, but they knew that everything needed to be kept together in order to thrive, to grow, to survive.
You're going to talk about the emperor?
As a pontifex?
No, so, well, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But also part of this banquet and the Thanksgiving you were doing were done also to honor the emperor, and in some banquets you would actually pour in honor of the emperor, who was also construed as a god. And so there is this, because there is this kind of continuity between institutional power and the power attributed to the gods, and how the emperor was also a form of god. Mm-hmm. And so to have these people come together to do libations to a god or to someone who was persecuted and was killed by the authorities is also a very powerful sign, because it's not like this is inscribed in political life, these libations too. They're not just libations to deities, or they're, because the political life is also religious, and so you cannot see them as separate, and both have to be held together.
Yeah, that's an
and so this is
point.
also a statement to do a libation and to have Christ at the center of these libations, and not the emperor.
And not the emperor.
Maybe some communities did both too, which is very possible.
Yeah,
but see.
That's interesting. This, I put a slide up here. These, if you went to a Roman dining room, these sorts of mosaics were very popular. It looks like they've had a jolly good banquet indeed, because they, as a joke, they used to make these mosaics on the floor of their banqueting rooms with the remains of the meal. So you would see things like, these look like chestnut husks. They've had a nice fish course up here. with seafood. Here's a fig that somebody's dropped, and here's a little mouse coming. I rather like this, to eat the leftovers on the ground. A little chicken foot over here, and some nice Roman snails that they took with them into France and into England too, where they're still called the Roman snails that you can actually eat. There's that passage from 1 Corinthians 11 that I just mentioned, with the words of institution that we still use in our communion services. So at first this Eucharist was known as the breaking of the bread, but it was also referred to, as you probably heard this word, as the agape, the love feast, but this didn't stick around very long. Do you have any more information about that word agape?
Yeah, I mean, all these transformations happened in the first 3 centuries, and there were different moments when the community gathered, and at the beginning they gathered in the evening. And then the morning took over, and then people started to move gather together in the morning, but in the morning was less substantial meals, so it's also one of the aspects of the transition to something less substantial.
Yeah.
And so progressively, but until Tertullian, so it's the 3rd century, there were communities gathering for this type of meals, so more substantial, which was also a way of feeding people. It's part of it was their feeding but that's, if I say feeding program, you'll understand it as very secular and it can be detached from the actual mission of the church, but that was a feeding program totally integrated in the worship of the community, because worship was not separate between what you do on one side as mission work or programming, and on the other one your fellowship was Christ through the meal.
Yeah, it seems that these early Christian communities followed the order of a Greco-Roman banquet. So they would have a solid meal, and that was followed by a sort of drinking party that involved, as we saw on those Greek vases, discourse, entertainment, the nice chat at which the wine would be served. Now, in a Christian setting, this second part of the meal would involve singing, it would involve prayer, it might involve inspired speech or sacred stories. And the people who were in charge of this, the leaders, were those who had some sort of authority or responsibility in the community in general. In the Didache that we just mentioned, the works of the 12 apostles, they're referred to as bishops or deacons who are in charge of these feasts. The meal itself wasn't just bread and wine, as Shoris just mentioned. When the meals were held, the commemorative meals, the celebrationary meals, the sharing meals were held in the evening. Quite a lot of different food was included. Could be oils and vegetables, milk, cheese, fish, meat. There's some indication in some of these early documents that if you were celebrating a new bishop or a new somebody or other, you would have a very special meal and serve all sorts of things. So it wasn't just bread and wine. It was the bread and wine became those parts of the meal that ended up, after a while, taking on a very heavy symbolic significance. And in the end, as Shoris mentioned, when the services moved from nighttime to daytime, or the morning, a much lighter meal might have been served, and in the end, this reduced to bread and wine, and we stopped having nice food and ended up with gluten-free wafers.
Well, this history, I think, is really interesting for us today, because it's also showing us how many negotiations there has been around what is the eating together, what does it mean, what do we eat, why do we eat that. And I think in this context of pandemic, where we cannot gather as we used to, it's also questioning that. And a good example of that is, for instance, why did they start to eat fish? And there has been different explanations about that. is that actually when you look at what Paul is talking about, all these problems with the diet, the meat, can we eat this meat, can we not? So you realize that meat is creating a problem because meat was sacrificed, but fish was not sacrificed.
But fish was not sacrificed. Yeah.
So if you have people coming together and eat fish, then you can have Gentiles and Jews and people gather together still eating this thing. So maybe you have to change a little bit the rules sometimes to actually make sure that people are still gathering.
It's interesting. I'd never thought of that before. Yeah, I'd always associated it with the Jesus Christ, Saviour of the world, ichthus thing, as the Christian symbol, but perhaps they,
that sounds kind of a good justification afterwards. But you know how a community is.
Yes.
You always have to deal with keeping things together, and if you find a good way, it's going to be via media.
Yeah. Yes, you couldn't really see this noble matron here dragging a halibut to be offered. It has to be something good and solid with blood in it to be significant. Yeah. So that's one of the things that we see from that. These are some pictures. I'm sure we've seen them before because Joris introduced us to this last year too when we were studying the Bible last summer. Was it 2 summers ago? 2 summers ago. Now we're in autumn. And I remember you pointed out here that what you've got is something that looks like a sarcophagus in the middle of this business. And here are the Christians gathering together, children, men and women, gathered around this ark of a table for the banquet. There are various other pictures of this from the catacombs, I believe, most of them. Here's another one. Looks like the part of the meal is over where they've eaten what they need to eat, and now in comes the wine and the Christian prayer and instruction and preaching and singing may be about to begin. And as you can see, they're quite small groups, aren't they? Yes. Enormous numbers of people.
And could you show again the slide just before? And this slide is also very interesting because it shows us how integrated the different aspects of the Christian worship are. You see, I mean, that's a funeral space, but it's portraying them eating, so partaking in the Lord's Supper, the Lord's meal, and at the same time gathered around the body of
yes.
one of their members of family or member of the community, and in their hope, because of the belief that he's Christ-like too, and his part is on the table, literally.
Yes, and the hope of resurrection.
At the same time partaking eternally with the everlasting meal of Christ, and at the same time he is Christ himself. So it's really integrated, the different aspects. We really have to break out of our very narrow understanding of power dynamics and very modern ways of relating things and testing them of if it's this, it cannot be this. And when we come to sacramental life later in this course, I think we'll see it too.
Yes.
How it's not as narrow as Western Christianity thought it.
And what we might discover, remember this little image here, this might be a martyr that they're gathered around from this particular period.
Yeah, a witness of faith.
A witness of faith. And we'll see how this might have developed in relation to Roman and Greek funerary practices.
Yeah, and miske, is it written miske?
Agape miske.
It's what mix. Yeah. It's what you do with the wine.
Ah, yes.
Yeah,
the mixes.
Yeah.
Here are just a couple of other pictures of this. They look far more chaste than the pictures that we were looking at on the Roman and Greek on the Greek vases. And in fact, some of these early Christian writers say, don't overdo it on all of this. And by the way, when it comes to music, be careful about what sort of instruments you're playing because they're associated with pagan sacrifice and debauch. Here's another one. With the person, the deacon or the bishop presiding in the middle there, with the arms outstretched in the orans position. Let us pray. And here are a couple more. from the Christian catacombs there.
Yeah, and you can see women partaking in it also. Different, probably, like all these things probably varied a lot from community to communities. If you just have a look at the diversity of texts we have from early Christians with the Gnostic Gospels, you realize that they had a lot of different attitudes also regarding the participation of women as in leadership role or not. And that's still the diversity you see today in Christian denominations, churches.
So where did all of this take place? Where were they doing these sorts of things? Were there lovely churches built, like, St. John the Divine or something? Well, no, not really. These Christian meals took place in people's houses, big and small. I remember, Joyce, you told us about Paul meeting above shops, for instance, where the shop was on the ground floor and then on the floor above. The Christians would have a little meeting there. There's also some indication that they met in these sort of semi-private clubs, where they'd, rent a space above the Roman baths or something that had a spare room that they could meet in, like some of the other societies that met together in the ancient world, not just the Christians, but other common societies that would meet together for symposia and eating shared meals. This house was excavated in Dura Europos, which is in modern-day Syria, and in about 100 years ago, maybe just a little over 100 years ago. And here you can see it's been sort of modified, this house. He must have been a fairly wealthy person, because it's quite a big house. You can see here that this room at the end that they're calling the assembly room seems to have been modified. It has more than one door here, and it looks like perhaps just as in Manhattan, very often these large spaces are divided so you can get more money out of rent. Here they've done the opposite. They've demolished the walls to make a bit more space so a larger group of people can meet in it. So this is the assembly room, what became called a church, I suppose. Here's a separate area for teaching the people who have yet to be baptized. There's the open courtyard in the middle, and down here you've got the baptistry, which is adjacent to the teaching area for obvious reasons. Nothing much is left of it, sadly, today. Most of the wonderful images that were inside it obviously have been taken away from the site to be preserved properly, so that the desert winds or the cold and the rain doesn't get to them. This building dates from about 213 or thereabouts. Here is the baptistry. You've got the vines and growing over the top here, this wonderful painting in imitation of water coming up on either side. The frieze at the back here, we're going to see in a second, is this. Good luck in deciding what it is. But if you have, yes, it's the Good Shepherd. So can you see the sheep here? And here's the Good Shepherd underneath. And here's a little mountain or something. So clearly it's a Christian house because it's full of these images. There's the image of the man taking up his pallet and walking after Jesus heals him. So it's a good example of what they call the earliest surviving church building in its original state.
In the same place, they excavated the synagogue too.
Yes,
yes. A couple of blocks away.
Just like today.
And so it's also interesting to see that the people who would go to these communities, they could also go to the other ones to have the teaching. So in the development of the liturgy in both, of like the liturgy in the Christian tradition and the service of the synagogue happened not so much like the synagogue influenced the church or the church influenced the synagogue, but they grew together, probably with a lot of influence.
Yes, between the two. And that perhaps is seen quite a lot in how they dealt with the word. Why do we read the Bible in church, and what did they read before they had the New Testament? What did they do when they didn't have a New Testament to go to? Did they keep reading the Old Testament? Did they supplement the Old Testament with other stories? Were there little scraps of paper that was circulated, like Paul's letters or something, that they might have read at these banquets after they'd had their food together and they were having their wine and sharing those things? John's Gospel starts out, as we know, by John telling us that Jesus is the Word made flesh. So we've talked about the fleshy bit, the meal, and now we're going to talk about a little bit about the wordy bit. What were the words that were being used here? These words were intrinsic to Christian worship from the very start. The words might have been scripture that was read aloud, say the Psalms, or as Joyce was just saying, the line between synagogue and church was a little blurred, and that was very much the case when it came to what might have been read in these early Christian communities. They might have been scripture, or they might be what we call preaching or teaching today. The Gospels were probably not the first Christian literature that was used in these assemblies, because they weren't written until several decades later. Christians had already been meeting together in these meals for a good generation before, say, John's Gospel appeared on the scene. And it took a while for certain Gospels to be accepted by the whole church. For instance, the Gospel of Matthew was favoured by the church in the East, and it took a little while for it to gain ground in the churches of the West. So there were times when, certain Christian communities had access to certain things, but not access to others. In relation to this, see, you've got on the screen now a scroll. They were done in separate books or separate letters and kept in a basket. So these early Christian communities might have had a little basket where they kept some of these letters or readings or copies of things that they'd made. And then if the bishop said a little bit later on, no, we don't like that one anymore, it wasn't like taking up a big hefty Bible nowadays and ripping out a book. You could just dispose of the scroll and put it somewhere where people wouldn't read it anymore. The Christians also...
Or keep it for your private reading.
Yes.
If it's not a public reading. Some lists actually say, well, this one, yes, but not in the church.
Yeah, perhaps a bit like the Acts of Paul and Thecla.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you read that this evening?
I did.
Yeah. Christians eventually invented this method of recording their works. Basically, they believed because if you have a scroll like this, and you say, well, how can we compare what Jesus said here with what he might have said there? You're going to be rolling and unrolling and fiddling about. It's going to take you 20 minutes to find your quotation. And also it's going to damage the scroll. It's quite a physical exercise. And they said, why are we doing this? We might as well cut it into slices, use both sides of the thing, and invent a codex, a book, which is much quicker to go through, where you can compare things and read things more easily. But they were probably still kept in individual copies rather than what we call the Bible today, as we discovered a little bit during our study of the Bible. During that meal that we have described, people in the very earliest time probably would have shared stories and sayings of Jesus. Perhaps in a way that we might nowadays call a bit random. They might have said, oh, that story about Jesus doing this miracle reminds me of this one that I heard. And as time went on, those stories might have developed a particular form, just like our children's stories say, once upon a time there lived a princess in a castle in the middle of a wood. And people would remember how the stories were told, and they would have taken a more sort of formal form as time went on. But at the beginning, they were probably more inspired, prophetic, I don't know.
And as people traveled to, you had preachers who would travel, people who would travel from one church to another and bring traditions from other churches. But you also have to see, like, if you actually believe that the meal is the presence of Christ and that this gathering, you're with Christ, then you can be inspired during these very meals. And just like Paul says, Paul never saw Christ, and he talks about and he teaches about Christ. And so you could see inspired how stories could be shared from the meals themselves, even if the doors are closed. You see, so it can organically rise from the communities, and that's how different texts also grew and developed by the close reading of the Hebrew Bible and different texts from the Hebrew Bible, and deciphering in them, just like the eunuch, the signs of Christ, and understanding what's happening in Isaiah, and then telling what they understood from it, and wrote stories about it. That's how all these texts have been written.
How they came about.
Inspired, and the transmission of the inspiration, both by very deep devotional reading of the texts, and also the life of the community, that is not only a one person that wakes up one mornings and say, out of my head I'm going to make that. It's like deeply grounded in devotional reading, communal practices. So in that extent it's very different from some texts like the Book of Mormon, if you believe the Book of Mormon is inspired or has been written by, I can't remember his name, or like modern forms of inspiration, which usually come from one individual.
Yes, who's possessed by a genius,
Yes.
a certain inspiration. Yeah. It's a bit like that Caravaggio picture of Matthew alone in his study with the angel guiding his hand.
Yeah.
So perhaps some of the books of the letters of Paul, or perhaps some of the other, but Revelation maybe was produced in. It's not like there's only one way in which those texts came about, but certainly I like the idea of the New Testament being written over meals.
Yeah. And we have different
sharing.
versions of these texts too. So this different version bear witness to the fact that there was different sources. Like not everybody had the exact same copy. It's once again difficult sometimes for us to understand that, because we live in a period of printing. So like we think having exactly the same copy is totally normal, but it's not.
And in a period of high literacy as well, whereas back then not everybody could read, which meant that certain lectors, if there was something to read, would read, or certain people gifted with a very good oral memory would be able to conjure up these stories, like Fahrenheit 451. Have you read that book? I can't remember the author of it, but the pretext of the book is that a government comes to power that wants to destroy every printed word, and a group of people get together to memorize the great works of literature. And one of the people in this, they're just relying on images on screens now. And one of the people in the book is told, you are now the only repository of the whole story of this particular novel in the whole world. You are that novel, you are that story. And if we lose you, we lose the book. It's very powerful.
That's a very, very interesting story, but when compared with actually what was happening, it's very different. Because this is a modern situation.
Yes.
You already have the book, and you kind of memorize it, like you kind of swallow it all together. But this is a very different process that we're witnessing in the first church, because it's actually the coming together of different stories. It's not just one story that's like flowing
already
into,
there.
flowing
Yes.
into you.
Yeah.
It's the coming together of so many different threads that are actually united in these traditions and in the church itself, herself. That's very interesting.
The music. This may not look to you immediately as like a musical score, but it is. It's the Oxyrhynchus papyrus from Egypt, and it's taken an awful lot of effort to decipher this. What you can see here are lines of Greek text interspersed with these funny little squiggles. And it took people a little while to figure out what these funny little squiggles were. And suddenly, somebody had the bright idea that this must be some sort of musical notation. And they were able to decipher the musical notation. As you can see, it's a French person who had a good go at this. First of all saying, oh yes, look, there seem to be 20 notes, 31 letters. Let's divide them up and put over each syllable what the symbol is over the top of it. And by a very slow and painstaking effort, they came up with this musical notation. So they even could tell how many beats there might have been to each of this part of the chant here. And this would have been, as he's notated here, liberamente, which means more like a recitative. All on one note, and you choose the rhythm and the speed that you want to sing it, and then a chorus of people's voices, men's voices in this particular case, would join in with a sort of chorus at the end. Now, if you attend a great cathedral today, or a megachurch in a Protestant denomination, a lot of the music in the worship is going to be performed by professionals or semi-professionals. And it's going to look something rather like a spectacle. You know, if you go to one of the great cathedrals here in America or in England or in France, you've got a professional choir that's paid. There are parts of it where you have to sit and listen, and you're not invited to join in with a terribly complicated piece of, De Rufflé's Requiem or something. You sit there and listen. In the earliest church, it's clear that this aspect of a community gathering, performance was secondary to everybody joining in. In other words, you wanted some music that everybody could sing together. Partly because I think the early Christian writers who disapproved of the musical instruments and the debauchery that characterized a lot of these associations of people that came together, they did have exotic dancers and wonderful musicians that could be hired to come in to entertain. But this was not part of the community spirit of these shared meals. So the music was preferably to be sung by everybody. But as time went on, specialists in chant and music arose in those early Christian communities, and certain parts of the music would be sung by a choir or a cantor rather than by the whole group of people together. Instrumental music was more associated with pagan sacrificial cults than it was with early Christian communities. It's been the case in some other denominations as time has gone by too. I'm going to cover baptism very briefly. Christianity, it said, entered onto the scene with a bath and a meal. That's the way it started. We've discussed the meal, and here we're going to talk very quickly about the bath. This is the baptism by Philip of the Ethiopian eunuch. The New Testament suggests that at the very beginning, baptism wasn't a sort of private thing that happened behind closed doors in a baptistry. It was a sort of spontaneous, semi-public act of bathing. So Philip is in this carriage with the Ethiopian eunuch, and the Ethiopian eunuch says, look, there's some water over there, which the dog in this picture is drinking. What's to prevent me from being baptized? And Philip says, let's get out of the carriage and I'll do it. And there they all are, sort of watching on in the background. This isn't done in a private baptistry. He's been painted very prettily in a white fur. What he's wearing fur for in Ethiopia, I don't know, but there we go. It's close enough. Maybe there are some cold bits. The mountains, yeah. So when you think of John the Baptist's ministry too, it's something that happens very much in public. It's not private. It's also
not kept on records either.
No, not carefully inscribed.
Yeah, it's not controlled in this way, like modern Christianity has controlled it.
Yes, yeah.
For many centuries, actually, baptism was not recorded.
It was not recorded in official books.
No, because it was recorded by God.
Yes, you would remember. It's also true that this sort of blessing of a pool of water, seemed, in particular, for baptism, seems to be an early practice. They wanted the water to be cold and preferably running in the very early period, but as time went on, that was less and less possible. Children and adults were baptized in the earliest period, but as the centuries rolled on and the church grew, the baptism of infants became more and more the practice. And also these other signs in baptism came to be introduced. Anointing with oil, for instance, laying on of hands, the wearing of white robes, going for a week-long retreat in Holy Week before you were baptized on Easter Eve. These were all much later developments and not really characteristic of the rather more spontaneous impression we get from the way baptism was done in the New Testament. Rather à l'improviste, without some sort of formal liturgy that was accompanying it. Yeah.
That's very interesting to see. Like here, it happens at the river, but there is also a close connection between early Christian worship places and baths houses in the Roman Empire, because there were places where you usually had like gathering rooms too. But like in Mayenne, in the city of Jublin, you can see the church is actually built at the place of the
Roman bathhouse. Yeah. This is another place where churches grew up. Just another couple of observations. I know it's getting a little late. What you can see here is something that we call, or the Romans called, the refrigerium. In the Greek and Roman world, a meal that takes this name of refrigerium was held at certain times at the grave of the dead, of a dead person. So food or drink was spread over the top of the sarcophagus, and then a little pipe led down into the vault or the tomb where the wine could be poured, or even some grain could be poured. These little services at the grave of the dead were festival affairs with eating and drinking and music making, dancing. They would decorate the graves with garlands and wreaths. So here you can see the deathbed scene of a soldier. There's his helmet on the bottom there. They're giving him a last drink of wine. Here's presumably his widow on the right-hand side here, who is weeping. But this is a foretaste of what they're going to be doing 30 days after, 30 weeks after, however long these official periods were, where they'll come back to the same sarcophagus and say, look, we're going to do the same for him now he's gone that we did for him when he was alive. And these sarcophagi can often be very elaborate. But here's an example of this little pipe or tube that leads down through the hole in the top of the sarcophagus, where the wine and the grain could be poured through as a libation or an offering to the person who'd died. Now, Christian leaders back here often encourage their flock not to mourn their dead too excessively, but just rejoice that they'd entered into an eternal life. So they said, well, why don't you have a Eucharist on top of the grave instead of a refrigerium party? Now, we know that this exhortation of the bishops and leaders, like many exhortations of bishops and leaders, were more observed in the breach than in the observance. It was very difficult to break people's traditions around funerals, which are very deeply culturally ingrained in us. So Christians still went to the graves of their beloved and had this ceremony that they would celebrate there. The Eucharist celebrated on top of these sarcophagi now were these agape feasts that included the dead. Just as we saw earlier on in that the picture from the catacombs with the sarcophagus that's laid in the middle of the agape feast, expecting the resurrection of the dead. Here's a very, very elaborate Roman sarcophagus which gives you some idea of what went on around these things. These are not images from life, they're images to celebrate the life of the person and what they're going to be doing around these great graves when they come back to visit with sacrifice and celebration. So the anniversaries of the death of martyrs, for instance, became occasions where these Christians would gather for all-night vigils in the cemetery where they were buried, especially at times when Christians were persecuted, because Romans had great respect for their dead, and if Christians were gathered together around the tomb of a dead person at night, that they were not subject to the same sort of suspicion as they might have been had they been meeting together in above the Roman bathhouse or something for agape feast. Now you can see the influence of these practices on the Eucharist when you look at the history of the development of the shape of an altar. See how these sarcophagi look like altars very often. This is an Etruscan one in a museum in Rome. As Christianity became a legal cult in the Roman Empire, very often the churches moved to these big basilicas because they needed to contain much bigger assemblies. Churches weren't just built, as we just heard from Joris, over the top of Roman bathhouses because of their proximity to water and having large meeting rooms. They were also built over the graves of martyrs, with a communion table or an altar that was over the martyr's grave. Now, the most famous of these is an empty one. That is the empty tomb of Jesus. When we looked at the history of Christian architecture, we saw that these tombs of the martyrs, or these great centres of great Christian events like the resurrection or the crucifixion, they weren't long, straight basilicas, they were round buildings, because everybody wanted to be as close to the grave of the martyr or as close to the event as it was possible to be. So this is the edicule of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the empty tomb of Christ, built in this circular fashion. But we can see that this is perhaps the most famous of them all. This obviously is St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican in Rome. What you can see here is what's over the top of it, but what's interesting for us at the moment is what's underneath it. Here are some little gates that when you open lead to a series of steps that go down and down and down into the catacombs, and right underneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica are the remains of St. Peter himself. So it's said. Built on Vatican Hill. This spot was a cemetery when this was constructed. It was outside the city of Rome. It wasn't in Rome itself. Sometimes the relics of these martyrs were transferred from their original resting place to new churches, where they would be placed under the altar. So the shape of the altar moved from this sort of thing. Here's an altar of the 5th century, it's 400s, a bit late for our period, but you can see you can't hide much underneath this, it's sort of on a pillar. Altars stopped being open tables, and they were walled in, because underneath, inside, were the remains of a martyr or a great Christian that you were reverencing, and this celebration of the resurrection over the remains of a martyr was a way of once again sacralizing the Christian hope in the resurrection that is celebrated during the feast that takes place on the top of the altar and seems to have been derived in some way from this Roman practice of visiting these sarcophagi to remember and give offerings. It gave the altar a more chest-like form, and even though our altar at Saint-Esprit is not built of stone, it's chest form in the form of wood. So gradually these wooden altars in very early churches, these great benches that people ate at, were replaced by stone altars that looked like sarcophagi, like this one here. And sometimes now the practice is to put, in the olden days there would be a little grill that you could look through to see the remains of the person inside, but now very often you'll find a saint is buried under the altar with this glass frontage on it, offensive to Protestant sensibilities maybe, but mostly not because we think it's grisly perhaps, but because it threatens the security of our understanding of the Eucharist being a symbol and not a real enactment, not even an enactment, a presence of death and resurrection. The Christian belief that Christ's death and resurrection were, are, and will be in the moment of the Eucharist. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. What do you think we're going to talk about to finish with? It's the book of Revelation, something that is the favourite of so many of us. Many Christians today think about the book of Revelation as this book of horrible and terrifying prophecy. It's used to predict the end of the world and describe the triumph of Christians over their enemies. Here are some rather grisly images from the book of Revelation that we're perhaps familiar with. This is a famous one of the many-headed beast and the many-headed dragon threatening the integrity and beauty of the church. Yes, the Tapestry of Angers. Yeah, it's a beautiful tapestry here. But perhaps it's going to be more constructive. I do hope this helps. To think of the book of Revelation as a book that describes some of the worship practices of the first Christians. It's a huge resource for liturgy. Its primary use isn't to terrify Christians about the end of the world, or scare you into the kingdom of God, or say, I know when the end of the world is going to come, and those enemies of Christians are going to get what they've got coming to them. There's far, far more in the book of Revelation about liturgy, about worship, than there is about prophecies to do with the end of the world. And it is something to do with how we've inherited that book and interpreted it over the years that says two things. One, a lot about where our Western Christian mind has led us around death and judgment. And two, the fact that a lot of our Western Christian worship has been voided of its celestial content, for want of a better way of putting it. In other words, what the book of Revelation is doing is describing the work of heaven, the worship of heaven, in which we are now invited to participate. And so when we get together to do something that we call worship, we're not participating in earthly time. We're not using earthly words or earthly gestures. We are living in the 8th day, the day of recreation, the day that is outside our time, the great day, the great eternal day of God. And the book of Revelation is daring enough to try to describe that. So, let's think for a moment. I need to make it a little bit shorter. Chapters 4 to 5 of the book of Revelation, John is summoned to be a spectator in the heavenly court. He doesn't see a vision of the future, not in the first part of Revelation. That comes in a couple of chapters near the end. The first thing he sees is celestial worship. He catches a glimpse of this heavenly worship that's eternally made before God. So this ideal church of 24 elders is represented. God's counselors are seated all around, just like in a Roman court or in the seating arrangement of the earliest Christian basilicas, where the bishop is seated on the throne in the apse of the church and all of his presbyters and deacons are surrounding him. This arrangement comes from the book of Revelation. Even the way we sit and are physically present in church comes from this vision of the celestial court. All of the creation is implicated in this worship. It's not just human beings, not just the angels, but these 4 living creatures around the throne. Here we can see them. Look, the lion, the ox, the eagle, and the angel, the winged man. Here we can see the adoration of the Lamb that is central to this vision of John, who is worthy to open the seals and to read the names in the book of life. They sing this song of praise to God as the ruler of history, who's going to liberate or restore creation. And God and the Lamb are worshipped together in the book of Revelation. They're equal in majesty. They're equally worthy to receive blessing and honour and glory and might forever and ever. And so this book of Revelation is a vision of the time when all creation is going to be freed from imperfection and transformed, like the church, like the worshipping church, to the glory of God. There are 3 canticles in chapters 4 and 5 of the book of Revelation, including one that we sing or recite in communion. Holy, holy, holy Lord, God of power and might, heaven and earth are full of your glory. That's from Revelation. Without Revelation, we'd have no liturgy. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. You might remember that, Catherine, and those who've sung in Handel's Messiah. These words too come from the book of Revelation. Here you can see the 4 creatures around the throne and the Lamb that was slain, representing all parts of creation in its courage, in its foresight, in its strength, in its dignity. All of creation here represented in the 4 living creatures. Holy, 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 I just mentioned, book of Revelation is where it comes from. There are actually 4 Alleluia choruses in Revelation, in chapter 19. Here's Handel's original manuscript for the famous Hallelujah chorus in Messiah. You can see he's being transported there. He can't get it down quick enough. It's occasionally, Amen, Amen, he says at the end, and his pen is scraping on the page and splattering the ink in this act of worship in his composition. So at the beginning of chapter 4 in Revelation, John says, after this I looked, and there in heaven a door stood open. And this door is the communication between our earthly worship and the heavenly worship, where the 2 interweave together, when the opening is there, and when we can, here's the little door into heaven up on the top left-hand side. Obviously this is the Hieronymus Bosch vision of John on the island of Patmos. So the book of Revelation is intended to be this bridge between our earthly worship and our heavenly worship, and perhaps is, in the end, the book of the Bible that has bequeathed most to us in terms of the form of our worship today. I've gone on a bit long. I think that's all I've got, apart from some questions that we might want to consider. I don't know how much time we've got for these. Joyce, is there anything you wanted to say about Revelation? I just flicked us on.
Maybe just that, as you mentioned, like it's linked to the worshipping, the place where people worship. So it's a liturgy, so it's linked to the architecture of the place, and this door is also the door of the sanctuary. It's the door that you cross to enter, but also to leave, to go back into the world. So it's also like these questions of like different words. It's the space of the liturgy, it's the place of the earthly liturgy, the place of the place of the heavenly liturgy, but also the place of the whole world, where the liturgy is supposed to inform this world. And it's also the question of like the procession is also a recalling of the ascension to the altar, which is the mountain, and everything happens on mountains in the Bible. Where the temple is, where the Garden of Eden is, where Christ is giving so many of his teachings to. So everything is on this
on
high
the
place.
height of the mountain. Yeah. We'll be coming back to that a little bit when we look at Schmemann and what happened to Christian worship in the years after we've been talking about. So just a few questions we might want to consider. The first, how does this early church understanding of worship inform what we might think of as worship today? Is worship just something you do in church? And I think looking at the way that early Christians saw their whole lives in terms of worship can expand our minds just at the moment. Confined as we are, with the church half open, half closed, not sort of in a suspended place, that doesn't mean we don't worship. Doesn't mean that we don't worship when we join either online, when we're present in God's time, in God's place, not in a place that we define as the place where it's appropriate to worship or right to be. So perhaps that's a good message that our brothers and sisters from that very early century can tell us, that worship is not something you just do in what you're calling a church. We didn't have churches. The second thing perhaps to consider is, what's the connection between our Holy Communion services that we have in church and our coffee hours or our parties in the garden afterwards? Because clearly the early church didn't really make that distinction. The very earliest church, the coffee hour was the service. The party was the service, and it was done with dignity and with intentionality. But it was also had spontaneity to it too, as they were telling the stories and prophesying or praying or reading what they had. So perhaps they can teach us that this line between what we might call a secular party in the garden after church, that we might graciously call fellowship hour or something, the line should be a bit more blurred between what we do in church and what we do when we're able to in the garden or in the parish room afterwards. We began to do that last year when we began it several years ago, for instance, when we brought the Colivar into the church to commemorate those people who died in the previous year. Something that we were going to eat and share together was a part of the liturgy. Recalling that early Christian practice. Perhaps we could do it with more things in the church, to blur the line between what we call the worship service and the fellowship hour.
Yeah, and what's the line between when we participate in the Eucharist online and when we eat at our places?
Yes, yeah. So how do we remember the dead in our own liturgies? Because clearly that was a very important thing for the early church. The martyrs, the link between death, resurrection and the Eucharist, that seems to be made far more clearly by our sisters and brothers back then than we might make it now, when it seems very cerebral sometimes and conceptual. And clinical. Yeah. But then, it's a slightly different story here. What should we do when we visit the church cemetery next? Do we need to put little pipes in the ground and give René Vaillant a little glass of wine and his wife in our Cedar Grove cemetery? We've limited ourselves to buffing up the obelisk, really, and having a couple of biscuits and a glass of cider, which is very much firmly in the Christian tradition. Are there other ways that we can do that? When we visit the cemetery, is it a happy or a sad occasion? Happy, I think. That's something that the early Christians taught us too. So it's not that we looked at this purely from an academic interest to see what early Christians did. They're still teaching us. They're still telling us stories. They're still giving us their testimony of the dying and risen Christ. And finally, does reading the Revelation as a book of worship help you understand it better? Is that a more healing way of reclaiming one of the most difficult books in the Bible? And in connection with that, why do we read the book differently as a prophecy about the end of the world? Who's told us that that's all it's about? And why did we believe them? And were our understanding of the integration of liturgy or worship in our Christian lives understood as a participation in the divine life a stronger tradition in our Western world? Would we not have fallen for the ruses of those who told us that the book of Revelation is just a book of prophecies about the end of the world? Would we have said, sorry, but I think there's more to it than that, and you've got the wrong end of the stick here? Not just, oh, you're interpreting the prophecies wrongly. We would have said, you're using the book for something that was never intended to be used for. You've made an ugly thing of something profoundly transforming and beautiful. How dare you blaspheme the book in this way?
Yeah.
It certainly helped me when I reviewed it to think of it in those terms, knowing
And
how
the interesting thing is that the person who actually started to read this book this way were also the person who got rid of it in the liturgy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Because if you want to import a historical, political view on the book of Revelation, you also need to take down its actual liturgical component. And you want to make it a very aggressive book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas the liturgy is not about aggression.
No, and control and what happens out there. Yeah.
Let's see the quiet and the tender revealing of Christ in this prayer and this moment together. Ô Dieu, qui nous fait désirer ce qui est saint, choisir ce qui est juste et accomplir ce qui est bon, donne à tes serviteurs cette paix que le monde ne peut donner, afin que nos cœurs s'attachent à tes commandements et que, délivrés de la crainte de tout ennemi, nous puissions vivre dans le calme et la tranquillité. Par Jésus le Christ, notre Seigneur. Amen.
Amen.
Bénissons le Seigneur.
Nous rendons grâce à Dieu.